Welcome to Ministry Mondays with Meg. I'm Meg. Hey everybody, welcome. We are so glad to have you with us today. Um, what is Ministry Mondays with Meg? Well, if this is your first time joining us, Ministry Mondays with Meg is where we talk folks who are serving in ministry, but beyond the traditional idea of what ministry is. So beyond the pulpit and what happens in that church building. Um, So if this is your first time, one, where have you been? But two, welcome. We're glad you're here. And we hope that you enjoy today's session. So I have a new friend to introduce everybody to, uh, Dr. Elizabeth Tamez Méndez. Did I say it right? And I should have
You
asked.
did. Thank
All
you.
right. All right. Because names are important. Names are so important. Who will be part of the Space for Grace, but that's not the whole reason she's here. She's here to talk about her ministry, New Generation 3, right? Or NG3.
Mhm.
Um, so this is my first time meeting you. For people who don't know you, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are, what you do, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Meg, for the invitation. We're really excited as we are on the countdown for Space for Grace. And it's just exciting to have a chance to meet some of the other presenters ahead of time through Mondays with Meg, Ministry Mondays with Meg. And so it's just been delightful to hear how everyone is serving in different contexts. And in my case, I always say it in this way. It's like I have multiple hats that I wear in different places. And my biggest role is to be a little rock in your shoe that makes you uncomfortable and makes you ask questions and think about things differently. So that's my biggest role wherever I go. But today, I know that we are approaching this conversation about reaching new generations. And a lot of my work then is through New Generation 3. I'm the executive director there. We started our ministry in 2001, and under its current modality, then we shifted in 2005. I'm also director of programs and grants at Leadership Education at Duke Divinity, and I am part of the research team at 10 by 10. And so, yes, that's what I was saying. It's like there's several hats and all tied to one story. And it's about how do we continue to help the generations connect and bring our conversations and our communities together.
I didn't realize you were on all of those. So you are incredibly busy then, like 10 by 10 and Duke and and being the founder and the executive director. I mean,
Yes, yes,
yeah.
yes, yes. Yes, it's
Do you have like these planners and all of this, like to try and keep all these activities? Wow.
yeah, and you can see I'm a pen and paper person because digitally is no way to be able to see the whole thing and um, have a grasp of what's happening and who are we saying yes to and where are we able to contribute. So it's a blessing. At NG3, we're a team of 11, and so then that's also um, trying to coordinate our work and make sure that we're all uh, being able to empower each other and move forward in what we've been called to do.
So for people who don't know what NG3 is, why don't you explain that a little bit? What about what you do there?
Yes, NG3. People are always curious about that name, and we tell them the youth chose it. And it also gives you some insight into the time when it started because now we're at G5 for cell phones. And back then, the big thing was G3. And so to
Right.
them, it just sounded really cool that we could put the name New Generation 3 into the ministry and what was happening there. And to us, as we grew and we moved from what was a local congregational ministry into what is now an international ministry, it was important to keep that legacy and that story of where the name came from, because it came from a local faith community, the young people who wanted to identify themselves with what was going on at that time in technology, and that was very big, but also looking into what does that mean to coming into new times. And so New Generation 3, as we have grown, we explain it to people with three keywords, which is people, perspectives, and future. So we're all about connecting people and expanding perspectives and shaping the future. So for business people, that's our business proposition, and this is where we move. Now, how do we do that? Then that presents itself in different modalities, from consulting and helping other organizations figure out ways to create those spaces for connecting people and expanding the perspectives and shaping the future. It's also research. It's also training, and we produce resources such as the JUNTOS book series that we're currently working on, to be able to continue moving the conversations forward, and also providing spaces for people to reflect and have some tools for their work.
Okay. So is that mostly in religious settings then?
So we, because my background is in architecture, and several of our team members also have other backgrounds in their careers, then we work with religious groups and churches and denominations and theological institutions, but we also work with other educational institutions that are trying to reach different groups, especially those who are first generation college students. And we also work with some other general nonprofits that are more for community development.
That's fantastic that it's not just limited to religious. I mean, I'm all for, religious not-for-profits and supporting them in their work, but that you're actually out there, because sometimes there's that idea that there's that bubble in Christianity, in the religious circle. Oh, well, you're just in that religious bubble. Well, sometimes you need to pop the bubble and expand yourself. So that's awesome.
Yes, and I think that's why it's big for us, that expanding perspectives, right? Because then that's very much in our design, that we are multidisciplinary, and we're on the lookout for information and learning and exchanging of ideas in different spaces that then can come and help us in our Christian walk and in our ministry and in our day-to-day to expand those perspectives to shape our future.
That's fantastic. So you're working more with the adults to train them how to relate to the kids, to work with the kids, what the future is, but it's your work is the training of the adults, not so much with the younger people, right?
Yes, it's been a progression. So it started with a traditional, per se, youth ministry at a local congregation. But really, for our congregation, there was nothing traditional about it. And I could explain more about that later. But we also have a chapter in one of the latest books for Intergenerate, and it tells more about that story of what that congregation looked like. And precisely because it was different and the community needed different ways of engagement and working not in a holistic way to ministry, to where when we were able to understand that it's really about that faith community coming together and creating a holistic approach to what that community needs in order to be able to move forward with their faith, with their mission locally, and what needs to happen. And so we saw that it was important to work with young people, for sure. However, if the adults don't share that same vision and expand that perspective, and particularly the pastors and the leaders of that faith community, then what the young people will be able to do will be very limited. And so we knew that for us, it was a matter of where can we make the most good and the biggest impact, and how can we also um, multiply the efforts. And we noticed that that was by investing in developing other leaders, and especially pastors in the congregational leaders. And so that's why every time people have a hard time sometimes explaining what we do, because they're like, oh yeah, you want to know anything about working with youth, go talk to NG3, right? And then we're like, yes, if you're expecting to widen your perspectives, if you're expecting that we're going to give you a 10-step recipe of how to work with youth, it's not like, we can't do that for you, right? It's like, because NG3 is very much about walking together towards discovering what it is that will be able to work in your context, and what is the kind of community and the connection of people that is taking place in that particular spot.
I imagine you must get folks who reach out and are just like desperate, like we need kids. I mean, I've served as a pastor in 2 churches, so I know what this conversation sounds like because I've had it. Oh, Meg, we have to have more kids. We've got to get more kids. But we're not going to do these things. We're not going to do anything until we actually have those kids here. And then you're going, but wait, if you don't do anything, then you're not, you can't just sit around and go, let's just wait till they show up, because they're not just going to magically show up. Like, I was at a church yesterday, and the little kids were taking up the offering and handing out bulletins, and I'm like, yes, we're talking like,
Yes.
I think kindergartners, like, and I'm going, yes, this is how you draw. This is it. Give them ownership in this. So, I imagine that must be a kind of a regular thing, contacts and going, how do we make kids show up? I mean,
yeah, that's just part of the ongoing constant conversation, right? Because I think culturally in the United States, we're very much have been trained and ingrained to think in that way, right? It's like, so how do I solve this so that it'll be successful? And that type of narrative and conversation then limits us to be able to see what is happening around us, and really being able to connect with the people who God has placed in our surrounding and under our care, really. Because if they're there, that means that we are responsible for how we will be able to connect with them and share with them about Christ, and share with them about their holistic development. And so over and over again, right, like we, especially in the beginning of our ministry, because people around us would see what was happening in our congregation and how engaged young people were, and little kids and adults, and it was just a very vibrant faith community that was reaching out also to the rest, not only internally but externally, with very tangible ways of engagement based on the needs of that community. So one of the big needs for that community was how to help kids navigate the educational system and be able to graduate and be able to then move on to the next step in their life. And so because of that, then we started seeing everything explode. And it was one of those things that, like, we didn't design it. I would love to say that as an architect, that we came in and we created a plan and we designed it and we knew exactly where we're going. It was just the community listening to each other and to the promptings of the Holy Spirit of what needed to happen next. So the congregation grew. It was vibrant. There was so much going on. So of course, naturally, people in the area were like, give us the recipe. Tell us what's the secret, right? Like, we also want this. And it became evident that, yeah, it's not going to be a 10-step program to be able to get there. You want to know the how, but it also goes hand in hand with the why and the so what. Why do you want to engage with young people, and for what purpose? So what? So they're going to come and do what? And where is our heart, right? And so that prompted us into what has now become this ministry that has been, like I was mentioning, in 2005. That's when we pivoted. And it was not planned. It was just one of those things that we could no longer serve in the local church and move forward with the ministry at the same time where there were publishing companies and big groups and other theological institutions who were like, we want to learn from you guys. We want to learn from you guys, right? And we kept looking for tools that could help us train and tell that story. And we realized that the majority of the resources that were out there, I tell people, it's like, we're in the land of resources, conferences, books, podcasts. It's like, there's so much available in the United States to do ministry and to grow in faith. And yet, everything that we needed for a local congregation and also to train others on how to do this, we just couldn't get a hold of. It's like, there's all this research, yes, but it does not include the particularities of different communities and their realities, especially communities of color and who come from a different ethnic and cultural background. And so that's how I ended up going into a PhD in leadership, because it was like, well, if we need to do the research, then I need to get a PhD so we can do this research. But that journey has then showed us, right, like the desire goes hand in hand with what you were mentioning, with the doing and shifting and expanding our perspectives, because we know that for so many, the thought of what you just mentioned, like kindergartners being so involved and hands-on, and it really pushes them into breaking some of the paradigms and the barriers that we have nurtured in our society, which are really counter biblical, because Jesus said over and over again, you want to learn? Look at the children. They're the first in the kingdom of God. And over time, we have continued to propagate they're the least, and they're the invisible, and they don't have a voice, and they cannot partake of the vitality of congregational life until they're adults. Right. And biblically, that is not what Jesus was teaching us about the importance of children and young people as our spiritual teachers.
How do we get there? I mean, what do you think it was about us, adults, whatever? How do we get there with the kids? Where that mentality, well, I guess the mentality, at least as far as I can think, is probably always been that way. But I mean, how do we get there?
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we try to highlight even to the churches, because we work with all different denominations. And as I mentioned, we work here in the United States, but also abroad. And everyone has a very different background and need, right? But part of what we also uplift communities of color, especially those who have a background from a different culture and nationality, is that in our societies, that is typically one of the distinctives, that our societies uplift children and elders. And that is something to hold on to and to continue sharing with others and integrate it into our ecclesial models so that others can learn from us, right? So for those in that context, it's more about how do you continue to nurture what you already have? For those who are in the majority culture, then it's a different narrative, right? And different perspective of how do we then start to expand our perspectives into looking at this faith community precisely as a community versus silos, and having the traditional inherited ecclesial models that we have of here's the children and here are the youth and the women, and right, and it's just part of what we have inherited, which worked at some point, right? And yet we're in different times. And I keep hearing this conversation, especially this weekend, right? The whole debate, why do we keep changing the time? That made sense when it was like
yes,
early industrial era, where there was like no electricity, where like life was completely dependent on daylight. Like, why are we continuing to do this? And that's the reality of societies and certainly churches, right? And faith communities, that we repeat some of those things that were great for their time, but require something different at this time. And so for us, it's just that paradigm shift of saying, how do we align our perspectives to biblical practices where no one is more than the other? We are one community together. Biblical teachings are very clear. It is our responsibility to lead children, to lead young people, to learn from one another. And it is about the vibe, the environment that we're developing. Do people want to be there, with regardless of their age, right? It's like, and that's going to have come with, where is our heart? And where are we looking for, right? Are we looking for numbers and attendance and offering levels, or are we looking for, are people really feeling connected here, included, and are we feeding each other spiritually? And so I'll pause there, because then I could share a little bit more about our book series and how that's responding to it.
Okay. And one other question I want to ask before we go to the books. So I've heard you say more than once that you were trained as an architect, and that this started back in 2003, and then you pivoted in 2005. But right, something. How did this come about?
Right?
So the
architect end up being an ordained minister.
Yes, that's I inquiring minds need to know. Yeah.
So I'm a storyteller, and I also come from a community of we are not linear thinkers, and we always speak to our inheritance from our ancestors, right? And so with that in mind, I'm going to try to make it as brief and short for our audience. And so I was hearing this testimony of the first Baptist woman who was assigned as a missionary, right? In one of your also one of your episodes. And it just reminded me, it was certainly about 100 years later, but of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. And she was from a German family who migrated to Michigan, who ended up going to Moody Bible Institute. And in the 40s, that was a big deal for a woman, especially whose mom had died, and she was the oldest of the siblings, who was expected to be at the farm and now become the mom for all her siblings, which were a lot. I think there were like 10 or so, or 8. And she just knew that education was what she was being called to do. And so she even moved, and she had a Baptist family who believed in that calling and supported her, and financially, and also living in a different place so she could go to high school before she could go to Moody, just these things. And then back then, they would also train them with a vocation. So in that, as she was being assigned to different places to work, she was assigned to China and the war broke out. And her things ended up on the boat somewhere in China, but she was reassigned to Venezuela, but they sent her to Mexico to learn Spanish. And as she was there in language school, she met this guy who was learning English. And you can imagine what happened, right? And so back then, but even now, the rules around missionaries and marrying the locals, it was like a big no-no. So she got kicked out of the missionary. uh, and so that didn't stop her from what God had called her to do. And she used her education as a nurse and training, because that's the training she received in order to be able to serve abroad. And it just ended up that over time, they had about 250 kids in an orphanage that they had established. And that was just the way they were reaching out to the community. So I come from that heritage of ministry and being able to understand that what we do in ministry and secular vocation is not divorced. It is one entire way of life, and being Christian and knowing how we're able to contribute to the world holistically in every area of their need. And so for me, it was the same thing. It was one of those things that was like, Lord, I'm seeking your will and your guidance, and where do you want to use me? And I knew that I had a passion for design, for architecture, and so I did that for about 12 years. It was my career. I did my undergrad and my master's, and in that process, then working with the community to build what needed to happen, then came these open doors that I was certainly not looking for, where the community kept pointing out to me that they felt that I could help them figure these things out about education and in their process. It was a mainly immigrant community whose parents had maybe had a third, fourth grade education because of the places where they were living in. There was that was like the highest grade you could go to school before you had to go to another city to get further education. And when you're part of the workforce in that family and in that farm, you don't have the luxury to go to another city to then come back, and it's like you're needed here to make the family and everything happen. So when they migrated to the United States, they knew that they wanted a different life for their family. They just didn't know how. And that's what started opening the doors. And I guess to them, they felt like, well, she's an architect, so she should know, right? Like, how do we do this? And I was like, we'll find out, because I didn't go to school in the United States either, so I don't know. It's like I was in Mexico and I was in Spain and I was in France. I don't know, but we'll figure it out together. Yeah.
I love that. I don't know, but we'll figure it out together. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest disposition that we can have, right? It's like, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. We will figure it out, and we're going to make mistakes in the process, and that's okay. That's part of the learning process. I think it's one of those things where it's like, if this is where the Holy Spirit is prompting us as a community, because that was very important. It didn't come from me, right? Like, I was fine in my architectural work in my firm. Like, we were doing high-rise projects. I was working on things all over the world, traveling, overseeing teams. I was very happy doing that. And the community kept sensing that this is something that is of dire need, and it's going to make an impact. They certainly couldn't articulate that way, but they knew what it meant. And it was just like, and we trust you to guide us, because we have this imagination that you know. And it's like, I don't, but we'll figure it out. I think that's the biggest disposition that we try to encourage leaders, right? To be the learning leader. That's one of the key aspects of leadership, to be that learning leader that is willing to explore and together with the community, find the answers for what needs to happen contextually in that ministry and with the people that God has placed inside and outside our doors.
So is this part of what you'll be talking about at Space for Grace? Is your story, or is it more practical, like hands-on kind of thing? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so at Space for Grace, we will be talking about this meta conversation, right, of reaching the new generations. And what does that look like for faith communities and congregations whose majority population comes from other countries and have settled here and are struggling with the reality of what we explain to them, the third culture. You have your original culture and way of life, and if you knew Christ prior to coming here, there was a certain way of looking at Christianity and life and church and how you live as a Christian. I remind people, even when I was growing up in Mexico, I'm originally from Mexico, being a Christian was meaning that you were being secluded from society and they were going to reject you. And many of our family members also cut us off because you decided to become a Christian, right? So the price and the meaning of what that reflects is very different from a country and society where it's more cultural and there's a church in every corner and there's, like, sure, I grew up as a Christian, but I don't know what that means or what the Bible teaches, or it's just part of the cultural ingrained, right? And so we try to help them understand that definitely your view of Christianity and what you were exposed to in your country is very different than here. And there's pros and cons to both. And now you have the younger generation who has a third culture because they're not American. They're not where you come from. They're that mixture. And we cannot say that that mixture is fixed either. Right? There's a lot of complications to that and so in a fun way, through a story, we're going to start having group dialogues where we will bring all these aspects into the community and talk about it, because many times we don't want to talk about it, so that then we can start dismantling what that means on the expanding the perspectives, because it always starts with that, right? It starts with the mind and the heart. If that has not shifted, we can give you all these ideas, like go do this, go do that. But if there's not a healthy congregation and leaders with an open heart, no amount of tips and tricks and 10 steps to this is going to get you there. And so we want to work with them more on that level during Space for Grace, and then be able to share with one another some of the glimpses we have seen of things that have happened in our spaces that perhaps some leaders will not have even noticed that had happened, that have created bridges between the generations that then can bring new life and new ways of doing things. So we always work with the leaders in that way, not from a deficit perspective that like you're not doing things right and this is wrong, and rather what is already happening there from an abundance perspective. There's things already happening there because the Holy Spirit is moving and is alive. But perhaps sometimes we miss it because there's so much going on in the background. Right?
That's going to be so good. That's going to be so good. And I want to make sure also your book. So you like talk about what's going on with the book series.
Yeah. So this comes from a research project that we collaborated with Fuller Youth Institute, and it's funded by the Templeton Foundation. And we took a look at aspects for character and virtue development. So Templeton Foundation, for those who don't know, typically extends grants and makes philanthropic investments in areas of science. And they were just very concerned about some of these social issues that are happening worldwide regarding character and ethics and leaders who are in public stages and are giving the message that it's okay to be a different person in public than in private, right? So we have created socially this narrative and even ministry, right? Like when I was hearing the history behind the first Baptist woman who was assigned as a missionary, that explanation of how we have this sense that there is private ministry and public ministry, right? And so it's okay for women to be in private ministry, such as the home and the rearing of children, and not in the public ministry, such as speaking and leading groups. And so we have continued that narrative that there's the public and the private. And then it's easy for us to switch on and off and say, well, I'm going to be this way in public, but really this is what's happening in private. I would hear many of my colleagues in the architectural firm who said they were Christians say, well, but see, that's how I behave on Sundays and with other Christians, but it's different here in the business world, right? Like there's other things that I need to be doing and the way I need to carry myself. And it's like, I get it and I don't, right? Because then where is that perspective again, right? That we're always emphasizing at NG3, and a lot of it comes from theology from René Padilla and Misión Integral, integral mission. And also my studies are in human development. And we always emphasize that to people. It's like, we are one. We have created this idea that we have separate silos. That is not how we were created. We were created in the image of God, and God does not have separate silos. God is, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of what we are continuing to encourage leaders, and that's why Templeton Foundation wanted to invest, because they said, you know, there's all these conversations about character and virtual development, but they're not happening in churches. They're not happening in faith circles, regardless of what faith, right? And we're like, isn't that what religious is supposed to do? Like teach people about ethics and values and convictions? What is going on? So they invested millions of dollars to say, can we get some researchers here to kind of share with us what is happening on your religious side? Because like people are not talking about these important things. And we're seeing the results of that at a global level with all these leaders who are just like, wait, what are you doing? So we did that research project from 2017 to 2022. And the results of it, we're now converting into practical tools to say, so what? So you have all these research findings, now what? And that's one of the big characteristics about New Generation 3. We exist to precisely bring those two worlds together with academia and the research that we're making, but then so what? How does this help me on the day-to-day? And so what came out of it was this structure of knowledge or knowing, relating, teaching, modeling, acting, and reflecting. So those are the 6 books in the series where leaders have a space to learn some tools and information that helps to inform their perspective and their theological postures, and also question some of their practices. And in that reflection exercise, then be able to answer questions for themselves of, so what can we do now in response to that? And that's a big thing about NG3 and the way we do the work. We don't tell you this is what you need to do. We walk alongside of you, looking at the particulars of your context, and the community there comes up with the answers. That is very labor intensive and does not bring a lot of money because we cannot work with 1,000 communities every year. Not yet, right? Like that would be one of the dreams, to be able to have more funding so that we can continue to grow the team and make it to where we can really do this with more faith communities, because that is where things are headed, right? It's like, it's so diverse now. Society is so different. Coming as a researcher and sociologist and human development scholar, I remind people to try to say that this is how youth are. It's just, we're creating an illusion for ourselves, because that is how that particular group that participated in the research reflects. And the majority of the time, communities of color are not represented in those research studies and findings, right? So I always hear people like, oh, like Gen X is this way, and the millennials are that way. And it's like, the majority culture is that way. Middle class suburban culture is that way. Because if you come, I'm here now in North Carolina, you go to the Appalachian Mountains, the majority culture communities that are there, Anglo, white, are not representative of what all these studies, and they're a big community. And they have completely different needs, and they have different ways of life and different ways of approaching their life, their faith, their development. So what does that community need? But I get it. I work with a lot of publishing companies, and you can't sell that, right?
Right.
You can't make money out of that because it's a very individualized program, right?
Yeah. So are the books available now? Like if folks wanted to go, and I'll make sure that we put links to the NG3 website. But do we have books available now for purchase?
And so we have the website is juntosseries.com, and juntos is the word for together, JUNTOS series.com, and we will have all that for our viewers there on the notes. And right now we are still working on that aspect. We are a team who does this on nights, weekends, holidays, vacations, birthdays, time off, out of virtually our own pocket. And so that means that we don't have the luxury of being able to say, oh, yes, we're going to have this done in a month, right? Because if somebody got sick that month, then we didn't get to do as much as we wanted, right? And so I think that's one of the challenges that a lot of us researchers of color are constantly facing, that the investments are not coming our way, and yet the materials are not there, right? I always tell people, it's like there's only 3 nation-level organizations started by Latinos, led by Latinos, doing work, research work for Latinos. It is Fe Vida from the Catholic Church, E625 from Disciples of Christ, and in other churches that identify with them, and NG3. There's only 3 of us.
That's it.
Wow. That's it. So if you want any books, training, videos, curricula. It's just the three of us. And certainly there's other resource production companies and organizations that we have collaborated with who have put out maybe some resources for other communities, for Asian, for African American, a lot of translation of materials into other languages, especially Spanish, but it's not created by Latinos for Latinos with our needs in mind. It's taking the majority culture resources and translating it into another language, right? Or taking leaders of color and asking them to produce some resources that are part of their bigger suite, right? But it's not targeted, it's not specialized, it is not what they do. It is something on the side. And so that just kind of gives us an idea of the reality of this world, right? Of ministry and publishing and resources. And so the book series will be housed there. And our goal is to have the first one out of the 6 out, because it will be in English and in Spanish. And one of the big challenges is that we also want to make it very interactive and fun. And so it's very graphic design intensive. So that also takes longer, other than just here's your white page with all your text. And the other thing too that is unique about this series and this product is that it is not for sale. We are providing it as an investment to other leaders in ministry, letting them know that we believe in what they're doing and we want to honor the time that they would take to interact with it and use it and put it into action in their context. And so it's at no cost to them. We have done the work of raising the funds and getting the grants so that it can be at no cost to them.
What a gift. What an incredible gift. Wow. And I know that you've done fundraising then, but if people wanted to support you, can they do that through the NG3 website?
Yes. So we are set up as a work group precisely because the funding has not been there for us historically, and we have a financial umbrella. And so then we would just talk about that. We have a fiscal umbrella that we work under to be able to receive support.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes. Well, I mean, we have listeners, we have those watching that want to certainly lift up you and the work that you and your team are doing. Yeah, we want to connect. We want to connect you. And again, what a gift that is that you were able to go. We've gotten the grants, and this is our gift to you. That's truly amazing. Truly amazing.
That's part of our values at NG3, that we want to invest in leaders and in their desire to grow communities of faith who are welcoming and have this expanded perspective, right, of how to shape the future and connect with one another. And so for us, that's part of our ministry ethos, that we want to support them. And we work mostly with communities that certainly are doing the work in the same way, in a volunteer basis, not by time or effort, but by funding, right? It's like they are doing all this work, what would be equal to a full-time job in ministry, right? But yet they're not receiving pay for it. And so since that's where we do most of our work, and this is where we do most of our investments, then this is why we operate in this manner.
That's just wonderful. So folks, if you haven't signed up for Space for Grace, they'll still take you. I'll put the link in the show notes as well, because this is important stuff, folks. This is important stuff. I hope that everybody comes out and hears this message because it's so, I'm a mom of 3, my oldest is 25, but my youngest is 14. So, and yeah, and it's hard. It's hard. And they need people, like you who've done this work, and we need to support you. I don't want to forget the joy question. As we're kind of wrapping up. So, in all these things that you do, which are a lot, right? But what's something what brings you joy?
Yes, I love that question because that is what I have on my Facebook tag. It's like knowing that I have the privilege of doing what God has created me for is my greatest joy. And I really do. Like I hear people who are like, "Oh, what are you doing this weekend?" I was like, I get to lock myself up, and we're gonna keep writing, and we're gonna keep editing, and they're like, "That's not." I'm like, that is joyful for me. That is life giving. That is something that I'm just like looking forward to and excited because it is a privilege to be called to speak into the lives of others and to invest in them and to come alongside of them with what we have and what we can offer, right? And so that's why I'm always reminding people, it's like, yes, we need to continue investing in this because there's only 3 of us doing this work, right? In an organizational level. And so for me, we just had a recent conversation about joy, and I was reminding the group, joy is a spiritual discipline. And I just threw them for a loop, right? And these are all Christian leaders. And it's like, really, because I always remember in Nehemiah 8:10, and it says, the joy of the Lord is my strength. And that joy doesn't come from external things, that they were going through a time of mourning when he said that, in trials, right? And I always think of people in the Bible who were being persecuted, and they knew they were in prison and they were about to die, and yet they were rejoicing and praising God and just giving a testimony of, we know this is greater than us, and our suffering is only by a moment, right? And so for me, it's just like, is that spiritual discipline that we culture and nurture. And on a personal level, part of what gives me that, aside from our work at NG3, is because I tell people, no, I'm not a workaholic. It's just I love it, right? It's like, I wish I could do this full time. Like, this is what God has called us to do. And that's why I gave up my career in architecture. But so anytime that I see art or I get to do art, it's just life-giving and joy. And like I tell people, it's like, if you don't find me, it's because I got lost at a museum, right? Because I'm just like contemplating some painting for who knows how long, or looking at every angle of that sculpture. And I'm a foodie. I am a snob. I want to go to all these 5-star restaurants and take a photo of who did what and how. And my youngest brother, he passed away, but we're always talking about how we were going to start a restaurant, and we were just going to do all these very unique things. And so like we think of chefs as rock stars, and we wanted to be like them. We just had to have our restaurant. So for me, between art and food, it's just one art form, right? And so I just find so much joy in that.
I'm so grateful for you, Dr. Elizabeth Tamez Méndez. I can't wait to meet you in person, and I'm grateful for this work that you're doing, being one of those 3 that is doing this work, and that you're offering it, to everyone as this gift and all that you do. I mean, that's what a gift you are, really. And you can you're just one of those people that it just radiates from you. Like this is, I'm doing this thing that I'm called to do, and you can't do it without a smile on your face, So thank you for this ministry and for sharing it. And your story, and I hope that this is just the first of many opportunities we have to connect and to work together, because who knows what God's up to, and when we're willing to put ourselves aside and say, here I am, Lord, send me. So for our listeners, thank you all for being a part of this. We will put everything in the show notes for you, and reach out, get a hold of Dr. Mendez if you're interested in connecting with her. And I'm just so excited for your future and G3, and to see what's coming next. So thank you for being a part of this.
We're excited for your ministry. Thank you for opening these spaces. They're so life-giving, and we're so looking forward to seeing everybody at Space for Grace. I think it's just a time of rejoice for all of us. And so thank you for your encouragement today, and the blessing of being here with your audience.
And we thank everybody for watching. We'll